I should have known that Saturday would end in murder. The velvet note was too perfect that night, the kind of perfect that always comes with a price in Chicago. Let me start at the beginning, though. My name is Ellie Hartwood, but everyone calls me Ellie. 3 years ago, I was a respectable widow from Philadelphia. Now I run a speakeasy beneath a flower shop, which tells you everything you need to know about how my life has gone since Thomas died. That Saturday in April, the air held that particular electricity that comes just before everything falls apart. I'd spent the afternoon arranging lilies in my shop, Hartwood's flowers, perfectly legitimate and perfectly boring. But as the sun set, my real work began. The Velvet Note isn't the biggest speakeasy in Chicago, but it's mine. You reach it through the back room of my flower shop, down a narrow staircase that smells of gin and possibility. That night, as I descended those steps, I could already hear Dolly's voice floating up, warm and rich as honey, singing "Ain't We Got Fun" to a crowded room. The basement was transformed, as it was every night. Burgundy velvet curtains caught the amber light. Brass fixtures gleamed. Small tables with white cloths dotted the space, each one occupied by couples leaning close, speaking in the hushed tones people use when they're doing something delicious and illegal. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, and beneath it all, the sharp, clean scent of juniper from Finn's gin. Finn O'Malley stood behind my bar like a gruff Irish sentinel, his sleeves rolled up, pouring drinks with the precision of a man who'd been doing it in shadier places than mine for 20 years. He caught my eye and gave me one of his almost smiles, the kind that said the night was going well, the liquor was flowing, and no one had started any trouble yet. Dolly finished her song to enthusiastic applause. She was magnificent, as always, her dark hair caught up in an elaborate style, her dress shimmering in the low light. Being Chinese in a speakeasy run by a white woman in 1920s, Chicago wasn't easy, but Dolly had a voice that could stop a room cold, and that bought her respect even from people who should have known better. I moved through the crowd, greeting regulars, accepting compliments on the flowers I'd arranged in small vases on each table. This was the dance I'd learned, the careful balance between proprietor and friend, between authority and approachability. I'd spent my childhood learning which fork to use at society dinners. Now I use those same skills to manage bootleggers and factory workers, debutantes and department store clerks, all mingling together in my little underground kingdom. That's when I saw Violet coming down the stairs, and behind her, the Ashworth party. Vi, my late husband's younger sister, the only member of the Hartwood family who believed I hadn't murdered Thomas, was 24 and full of the kind of enthusiasm that makes everything seem like an adventure. She waved at me, her face lit with excitement, and I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Vi's society friends rarely ventured to the Velvet Note. When they did, they tended to be more trouble than they were worth. The group she brought with her was exactly what I'd feared. There were 6 of them that included Vi, all dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that made my regulars take notice. The woman in the center was loud already, her laugh carrying across the room like breaking glass. "Ellie, darling!" Vi called out, threading her way to me through the tables. "You must meet Mrs. Ashworth. It's her birthday, and she simply insisted on coming here. I've told her all about you." Of course she had. Margaret Ashworth was 42 and looked it in the way that wealthy women do, well-preserved, expensively maintained, but with something hard around the eyes that no amount of cold cream could soften. She was already drunk, I could tell, carrying herself with that particular loose-limbed confidence of someone 3 drinks past propriety. "Miss Hartwood," she said, looking me up and down with undisguised assessment, "Vi's told me so much about you. The widow who opened a speakeasy. How terribly modern." The word modern came out like she was commenting on a questionable piece of art. I smiled my professional smile, the one I'd perfected over 2 years of dealing with Chicago's finest and worst. "Mrs. Ashworth, happy birthday. Any friend of Vi's is welcome at the Velvet Note." The rest of her party consisted of her husband Richard, a cold fish of a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, her nephew Leonard Fisk, whose rumpled collar and restless eyes didn't quite match the polish of his suit, and 2 others who introduced themselves as Diana Cole and Charlotte Winters. Diana had the sharp eyes of a businesswoman, and Charlotte carried herself with the careful composure of someone holding together something fragile. I showed them to one of my better tables, near enough to the stage to enjoy Dolly's singing, but far enough from the bar to feel exclusive. Mrs. Ashworth, Peggy she insisted I call her, immediately began demanding drinks. "Gin fizzes all around," she announced. "And make them sing, darling. It's my birthday, and I intend to celebrate appropriately." I caught Finn's eye across the room and made my way to the bar. He was already pulling down the bottles. "Rich folk?" he asked in that economical way of his. "Vi's doing," I said. "The loud one is celebrating her birthday." "That'll end well?" Finn's tone was dry as the gin he was pouring. I helped him prepare the drinks. 6 gin fizzes, perfectly mixed, each one topped with a flourish of lemon. We'd done this dance so many times that we moved around each other without speaking, a comfortable choreography of glass and ice and spirits. When the drinks were ready, I loaded them onto a tray and carried them carefully through the crowd. Peggy Ashworth was holding court at her table, her voice rising above the music as she told some story about spending her dear husband's money. I set the drinks down, and Peggy immediately raised hers. "A toast," she declared, "to another year of living exactly as I please." Everyone at the table lifted their glasses, and they all drank, but I had the feeling not everyone was celebrating. I returned to my rounds, checking on other tables, ensuring everyone was satisfied. Dolly had started a new song, something slow and sultry, and couples were moving to the small dance floor. This was what I'd built, what I'd fought for, this small space where the world's rules didn't quite apply, where for a few hours people could forget that alcohol was illegal and the future was uncertain. I'd been working the room for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard the commotion. It started as a change in the ambient sound, a gasp, then the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I turned to see Peggy Ashworth's table in chaos. Peggy herself was standing, or trying to stand, her face suddenly pale beneath her makeup. "I don't feel quite right," she said, her voice strange and distant, and then she collapsed. I was moving before my mind fully processed what I was seeing. Years of running a business in a dangerous city had taught me to act first and think later. I pushed through the crowd gathering around the table, dropping to my knees beside Peggy's still form. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. I'd seen death before. Thomas's death had taught me what it looked like, and I knew I was seeing it again. "Someone call for help!" I shouted, though I already knew it was too late. Richard Ashworth stood over his wife, his face blank with shock. Diana Cole had backed away from the table, her hand over her mouth. Charlotte Winters stood frozen, still holding her drink, her face absolutely white. Leonard stood there behind his chair, looking suddenly much younger than his 25 years, his bravado drained away with his color. Vi stood up from the table and came to my side. "Ellie, what—" "Get Bernie," I said quietly. "Tell him to clear the room. Carefully. No panic." I felt for Peggy's pulse, knowing I wouldn't find one. Her skin was already cooling under my fingers. Bernie Kowalski, my maintenance man, and the closest thing I had to a father in this city, appeared beside me with the quiet efficiency of his 62 years. He took one look at the situation and began moving people gently but firmly toward the stairs. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're closing early tonight. Please make your way to the exit. Carefully now, no pushing." Finn had moved to the entrance, blocking anyone from leaving until Bernie gave them permission. Dolly's singing had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. I stayed beside Peggy Ashworth's body, because that's what it was now, a body, until I heard the sound I'd been dreading. Heavy footsteps on the stairs, male voices, the harsh knock of authority that made everyone in a speakeasy flinch. The police had arrived. The first man through the door was one I'd never seen before, but I recognized the type instantly. A detective, not a beat cop. Tall, with tired eyes, and the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He wore a brown suit that had seen better days, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and measured. "I'm Detective James Sullivan," he said. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" I stood, acutely aware that I was the owner of an illegal establishment standing over a dead body. My name is Ellie Hartwood. I own this establishment. Mrs. Ashworth collapsed about 10 minutes ago. I believe she's dead. Sullivan looked at me for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression I was being catalogued and filed away in his memory. Then he crossed to the body, kneeling where I had knelt, checking what I had already checked. "She's dead," he confirmed. He looked up at the table, at the glasses still sitting there. "Who was drinking with her?" Before anyone could answer, another voice cut through the room and my heart sank. Well, well, a death in a speakeasy. How terribly convenient. Captain Frank Donnelly filled the doorway like a bad smell. He was a large man with a face like an angry potato and the kind of corruption that emanated from him like cologne. I'd paid him off exactly once, the price of keeping the velvet note open, and I'd hated every second of it. "Captain," Sullivan said, his tone carefully neutral. "Detective." Donnelly's eyes found me. "Miss Hartwood, we meet at last. I've heard so much about your little operation here." "Captain Donnelly," I said, keeping my voice level. "A woman has died. Perhaps we could focus on that." "Oh, I'm very focused." He walked slowly around the room, his shoes loud on my wooden floor. "A woman dies in an illegal drinking establishment. The owner's fingerprints are all over the glass. Very focused indeed." My blood ran cold. I served the drinks. Of course, my fingerprints— "Convenient," he repeated. "Detective Sullivan, I want Miss Hartwood detained for questioning. And I want this establishment shut down until we know exactly what happened here." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Captain, we haven't determined cause of death yet. We should follow proper procedure, Detective, which means treating the owner of this illegal establishment as a suspect in a suspicious death." Donnelly smiled at me, and it was not a kind smile. "Don't leave town, Miss Hartwood. We'll be having a long conversation soon." He swept out with the self-importance of a man who knew he held all the power. Sullivan remained, looking at me with something I couldn't quite read in his eyes. "Miss Hartwood," he said quietly, "we'll need to question everyone who was at that table, and I'm afraid I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow." "I didn't kill her," I said. "I believe you," he replied, surprising me. "But Captain Donnelly doesn't care what I believe. Be at the station at 8 tomorrow morning, and—" He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Be careful. The captain isn't known for his fairness." With that, he began directing the removal of Peggy Ashworth's body. I watched, numb, as they carried her up my stairs, through my flower shop, out into the Chicago night. The police finally finished questioning the birthday group, the staff, and some lingering witnesses. After they left, I found myself sitting at the bar with what remained of my staff. Dolly, Finn, Bernie, and Vi, my found family, looking at me with concern. "They think you did it," Finn said bluntly. He never was one for tact. "Donnelly wants to shut us down," I replied. "Whether I did it or not is almost beside the point." "That's applesauce." Vi's voice was fierce. "Everyone saw you didn't even drink. You just served the glasses." "Which means my fingerprints are on all of them," I said quietly. "He'll make up whatever story suits him." Bernie had been silent, but now he spoke, his soft Polish accent making his words sound like a proverb. "The truth is always there. You just have to look." I looked at him, at his kind, weathered face. "Bernie, I'm not a detective. I'm a businesswoman with a criminal record for running a speakeasy." "You're smart," Dolly said, "and you know people. You see things." "They won't listen to me," I said. "I'm a suspect." "Then make them listen," Finn said. "Or prove them wrong yourself." I sat there for a long moment, letting their words sink in. They were right, in a way. Donnelly would never give me a fair shake. Sullivan seemed honest, but he was one good cop in a corrupt department. If I wanted to save the velvet note, if I wanted to save myself, I'd have to find the truth on my own. "All right," I said finally. "Let's think this through. Peggy Ashworth came in healthy, if drunk, and died within 20 minutes. That suggests poison. So, poison in the drink. The question is, how did it get there? I prepared all 6 drinks with Finn. We didn't poison them. Could have been in the gin, Finn suggested. Then we'd have dozens of dead customers, Dolly pointed out. It was just her drink. Which means, I said slowly, thinking it through, the poison was added after I delivered the drinks to the table, while they were sitting there. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Who was at that table? Dolly asked. I closed my eyes, remembering. This was something I'd always been good at, remembering details, faces, moments. Peggy Ashworth, her husband, her nephew, Vi, and 2 other women. Those other 2 women were Charlotte and Diana, said Vi. After I delivered the drinks, I moved away to check on other tables. I wasn't watching them constantly, I pointed out. But you saw things, Bernie said. It wasn't a question. I opened my eyes. They were all unhappy. Richard and Diana kept glancing at each other, the nephew wasn't talking to anyone, and Charlotte's pale face, body limp and clutching her small handkerchief as if she was going to cry at any moment. It might all mean nothing, but, I said, I need to know who these people are, what their relationships were like, why anyone would want Peggy Ashworth dead. I can help with that, Vi said immediately. The Ashworths are society. I'll see what I hear around the usual gossip channels, she added. Tomorrow morning I have to go to the police station, I said. After that I need to investigate, carefully, quietly. I need to find out what really happened tonight. We parted ways around 3 a.m, each of us exhausted but unable to sleep. I locked up the velvet note and climbed the stairs to my small apartment above the flower shop. My bed felt cold and empty, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peggy Ashworth's face as the life left it. I must have dozed eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my window, and my alarm clock was telling me I had 1 hour before I needed to be at the police station. The police station at 8 a.m. was a study in institutional gray walls, gray floors, gray-faced men shuffling through with the weight of Chicago's crimes on their shoulders. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing my most respectable suit, pinning my hair in a conservative style. If I was going to be interrogated as a murder suspect, I'd at least look like a lady while doing it. Detective Sullivan met me in the lobby. In daylight, I could see more of him, the lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and longer cases, the careful way he held himself, like a man who'd learned not to trust easily. Miss Hartwood, he said, his voice neutral, thank you for coming in. Did I have a choice? Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Not really. This way, please. He led me to a small interrogation room that smelled of old coffee and older desperation. I sat in the chair he indicated, keeping my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. I'd been raised by Philadelphia society. I knew how to present composure even when my heart was racing. For the record, Sullivan said, sitting across from me, can you state your full name and occupation? Eleanor Margaret Pemberton Hartwood. I own Hartwood's Flowers, a legitimate flower shop on the near north side. And the velvet note? Is in the basement of that same building, yes. Sullivan wrote something in his notebook. You're aware that selling alcohol is illegal? I'm aware that enforcing that law selectively makes it meaningless, Detective, but yes, I'm aware. He looked up at me, and I saw something like respect in his eyes. Tell me what happened last night, from the beginning. So I did. I walked him through the entire evening, Vi arriving with the Ashworth party, Peggy's loud demands for gin fizzes, how I'd helped Finn prepare the drinks, how I'd carried them to the table myself. I told him about the toast, about moving away to check on other customers, about the collapse. You touched all 6 glasses, Sullivan said. I served them, yes. So did Finn O'Malley, my bartender. But you carried them to the table. I did. So your fingerprints would be on the glass that killed Mrs. Ashworth. I met his eyes steadily. They would be. They're also on the 5 glasses that didn't kill anyone. Sullivan nodded slowly. Captain Donnelly wants me to arrest you. My stomach dropped. Are you going to? Not yet. He leaned back in his chair. The medical examiner won't have results until tomorrow, but preliminary findings suggest arsenic poisoning. Do you keep arsenic in your establishment, Miss Hartwood? I own a flower shop, Detective. I keep all manner of things for pests and preservation, as does most of Chicago. That's not a denial. It's an acknowledgement that arsenic is as common as flour in this city. Anyone could have obtained it. But you had means, motive, and opportunity. What was my motive? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fear crawling up my spine. Mrs. Ashworth was drunk and disorderly, bad for business. You wanted her gone. So I murdered her in front of 40 witnesses? I shook my head. Detective Sullivan, I've spent 2 years building the Velvet Note into something respectable as an illegal establishment can be. Murdering customers would rather undermine that effort, don't you think? He almost smiled again. Point taken. But Captain Donnelly doesn't care about logic. He cares about closing cases and closing speakeasies that don't pay him enough. The words hung between us, an acknowledgement of the corruption we both knew existed. So what do? I asked quietly. You stay available for questioning, you don't leave Chicago, and… He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. And you watch your back. The captain doesn't like people who make him look bad, and you've already done that just by existing. Helpful advice, Detective. It's all I can give you right now. He stood. I'll be in touch when we have the medical examiner's report. In the meantime, if you happen to learn anything about Mrs. Ashworth's death, I trust you'll share it with the police. Of course, I said, standing as well. We both knew I'd do no such thing, not until I had proof solid enough that even Donnelly couldn't ignore it. Sullivan walked me to the door, and just before I left, he said quietly, Miss Hartwood, be careful. You're either very brave or very foolish to be running a place like the Velvet Note. Can't I be both, Detective? This time he did smile, just slightly. I suppose you can. I left the police station with my freedom intact, but my future uncertain. The morning sun felt too bright after the gray dimness of the interrogation room. I stood on the steps, taking a moment to breathe, to plan my next move. Richard Ashworth. I needed to talk to Richard Ashworth. I went to the flower shop, made sure the deliveries had gone out for the day, looked up Ashworth's address. It was just past noon when I finally made my way over to the Ashworth mansion. It was in one of Chicago's better neighborhoods, the kind where money was old and houses were older, where manicured lawns spoke of gardeners and polished brass knockers spoke of servants. I'd grown up in places like this in Philadelphia. I knew the language of wealth even if I no longer spoke it fluently. A butler answered the door, gray-haired, professionally blank-faced. May I help you? My name is Ellie Hartwood. I'd like to speak with Mr. Ashworth if he's available. It's regarding his wife's death. The butler's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. One moment, please. He left me standing in the foyer. A calculated slight that told me the Ashworth staff had already been informed I was a suspect. I studied the room while I waited. Expensive wallpaper, oil paintings of stern ancestors, a vase of flowers that hadn't been arranged with any particular care. Miss Hartwood? Richard Ashworth descended the stairs with the careful precision of a man who'd been drinking but didn't want it to show. He was dressed in black, appropriately mourning, but there was something off about him, a looseness around the mouth, a brightness in the eyes that didn't match his somber attire. Mr. Ashworth, I said, I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? His voice was cold. The police seem to think you caused it. The police are mistaken. I'm trying to find out what really happened to your wife. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling of being assessed and found wanting. My wife was excited to come to your establishment. Last night before we arrived, she said it made her feel alive, mixing with criminals and jazz singers. The contempt in his voice was palpable. Did you share her enthusiasm? I shared very little with my wife, Miss Hartwood. Ours was not what you'd call a love match. The admission was startling in its baldness. I see. Do you? He moved closer and I caught the unmistakable scent of whiskey. Peggy had her own money, you understand. From her father. I couldn't touch it while she was alive. But now... He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Now, things will be different. Mr. Ashworth, are you saying... I'm saying my wife is dead, and I'm finally free. Make of that what you will. He turned toward what I assumed was his study. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have arrangements to make. One more question, I said quickly. Did your wife change her will recently? He paused, his back to me. Last month. Cut out her wastrel nephew, gave more to various charities. Why do you ask? Just curious about who might have benefited from her death. Everyone benefited, Miss Hartwood. Peggy was exhausting, alive, dead. She's finally tolerable. With that, he disappeared into his study, leaving me standing in the foyer with murder in my thoughts. The butler materialized to show me out. As I walked down the mansion's front steps, I noticed scratches on Richard's hands. Fresh ones, the kind you'd get from a rose bush or from a struggle. But scratches weren't proof, and Richard Ashworth's motive was almost too obvious to be real. I needed more information. Vi had promised to meet me at a small cafe near the Loop, neutral territory where society women took their lunch and gathered their gossip. I found her already seated, 2 cups of tea ordered, her face bright with the kind of enthusiasm that made her seem younger than her 24 years. Ellie! She waved me over and I couldn't help but smile despite everything. Vi was like sunshine, impossible not to respond to. I've been asking around all morning. The Ashworths are the talk of the town. I sat down, grateful for the tea's warmth. What did you hear? Well... Vi leaned forward conspiratorially, her eyes sparkling. First of all, Richard Ashworth has been carrying on with Diana Cole for at least 6 months. Everyone knows it. Peggy knew it too. She told people that she didn't care, that Richard was welcome to his little distractions. Diana Cole was at the table last night, I said. Exactly. And get this, Diana and Peggy were even business partners. They owned a hat shop together on Michigan Avenue. The Cat's Meow, absolutely ritzy place. But I heard from Marjorie, who heard from Susan, that Peggy was about to dissolve the partnership. Why? Diana was embezzling. Not a lot, but enough that Peggy noticed. She was going to expose her, ruin her reputation completely. Vi took a sip of tea, clearly enjoying her role as informant. And here's the really juicy bit. That nephew, Leonard Fisk, he didn't just get cut out of the will. He threatened Peggy at the country club last week, said she owed him, that it was his birthright, all kinds of applesauce. Caused quite a scene. Vi paused, then added, Remember? I was at that table too last night. Sat myself right between Peggy and Diana, actually. I could sense that Diana wanted to have it out with Peggy, and Richard wasn't about to let that happen at a party. I was a barrier between them, and I know that Diana never got close enough to touch Peggy's glass or anything else. I processed this information, adding it to what I already knew. Richard had motive, freedom and money. Diana had motive, to prevent exposure. Leonard had motive, inheritance denied. What was Charlotte's motive? And more importantly, who had opportunity? Vi, I said carefully. Last night, after I brought the drinks to the table, did you notice anything unusual? She frowned, thinking. Unusual how? Anyone touching Peggy's glass? Anyone acting strangely? Her eyes widened. Oh, Charlotte! At one point after the drinks had arrived, she was fussing over Peggy with a handkerchief, dabbing at her face. I thought it was odd because Peggy seemed fine. Well, drunk, but fine. But Charlotte kept saying something about Peggy's lipstick being smudged. My heart began to race. Charlotte Winters, what do you know about her? She and Peggy were friends from school. Well, Peggy always called her a friend, but I don't think Charlotte felt the same way. I thought about Charlotte's face last night, the way she'd frozen when Peggy collapsed. No surprise, no shock. I would need to speak with her, too. Then my mind drifted back to Leonard. I need to find Leonard Fisk, I said. Do you know where he might be? Vi's face brightened. Oh, that's easy. He practically lives at Murphy's betting parlor on Clark Street. Goes there every afternoon. I finished my tea and stood. Vi, you've been wonderful. Thank you. Ellie? Her voice was suddenly serious. Be careful. If someone really did murder Peggy, they won't want you figuring it out. I'll be careful, I promised, though we both knew it was a lie. Careful women didn't run speakeasies or investigate murders. Careful women stayed home and did as they were told. I'd stopped being careful the day Thomas died, and his family tried to take everything from me. Monday dawned gray and heavy, like a secret waiting to be unraveled, and I was ready to pull at every loose thread. Murphy's betting parlor was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find disappointed young men with inheritance problems. The air was thick with cigar smoke and stale dreams, and the men hunched over racing forms looked like they'd been there since morning and would still be there at midnight. I'd brought Finn with me, not just for protection, though his presence certainly discouraged unwanted attention, but because he knew these places, knew these people. He nodded to a few familiar faces as we entered. He asked someone about Leonard, and we were directed to the back of the parlor. Leonard Fisk looked younger than I'd remembered, boyish looks, but with the kind of dissolute look that comes from too much money and too little purpose. He was studying a racing form with the intensity of a man trying to solve his problems with other people's horses. "Mr. Fisk," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. Finn took up a position behind me, arms crossed, looking like the kind of trouble Leonard didn't want. Leonard looked up, startled. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Ellie Hartwood. I run the Velvet Note, where your aunt died last night." His face went through several expressions: surprise, fear, anger, settling finally on defensive hostility. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're thinking." "I wasn't thinking anything yet," I said mildly, "though it's interesting that's where your mind went." "The police already questioned me. I told them everything I knew. After the toast, I took my drink to the bar. Aunt Peggy was getting loud and I wanted some space. I stayed there until I heard the commotion." I glanced at Finn, who nodded slightly. "That's right," Finn said. "He came over after the toast and parked himself on a stool for quite a while, but I didn't actually notice him return to the table, and his story lines up with what I did see." Leonard relaxed slightly. "See? I couldn't have done it." "You threatened her at the country club," I said. "Said she owed you." His jaw tightened. "She did owe me. I'm her only nephew, her only family, besides that cold fish Richard. My father, her brother, died when I was 10. She promised him she'd take care of me. And she did for a while. Paid for my schooling, gave me an allowance, then last month she just cut me off. Said I needed to learn to stand on my own feet." He laughed bitterly. "Easy for her to say, sitting on a fortune." "So you studied medicine," I said, remembering something Vi had mentioned. "Pre-med student. That means you know about poisons." Leonard's face went pale. Yes, but I wouldn't. Arsenic, for instance, easy to obtain, acts quickly when administered properly." "Miss Hartwood," Finn said quietly. A warning. We were pushing too hard, but Leonard was shaking his head vigorously. "I didn't kill her. I swear on my father's grave. I was angry, yes, but I couldn't." His voice broke slightly. "She was all the family I had left." I studied him, the trembling hands, the genuine distress in his eyes. Either he was an excellent actor, or he was telling the truth, and Finn had confirmed he hadn't been at the table most of the time. Leonard Fisk might have wanted his aunt dead, but he hadn't been the one to kill her. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Fisk," I said, standing. "I'm sorry for your loss." He didn't respond, just went back to his racing form with the desperate focus of a man trying to outrun his thoughts. Outside, Finn lit a cigarette and looked at me. "These suspects, none of them feel right. We'd best get back to the Velvet Note," Finn said. "Recreate the scene." The speakeasy looked different in the late afternoon. Empty, exposed, its glamour dependent on darkness and alcohol, and the feeling that you were getting away with something forbidden. I stood at the bar while Finn prepared 6 gin fizzes, exactly as he'd done the night before. Dolly had joined us, and Bernie too. They watched as I loaded the glasses onto a tray, as I carried them carefully across the empty floor to the table where Peggy Ashworth had sat. "Now," I said, setting the drinks down. Peggy was here. I indicated the chair. Richard was on her right, Charlotte on her left, and Vi between Charlotte and Diana. Leonard, on this end, squeezed in between Diana and Richard. After I delivered the drinks, I moved away to check on other tables. What happened at this table? "They toasted," Dolly said. "Everyone raised their glasses." "Everyone drank," I added, but Peggy kept drinking. She was already intoxicated. She wouldn't have noticed if her drink tasted slightly off. I picked up the glass that would have been Peggy's, examining it in the afternoon light streaming through the small basement windows. Finn and I had both touched all 6 glasses. Our fingerprints would be on each one, but only Peggy's glass had been poisoned. "The poison was added after I delivered the drinks," I said, thinking aloud, "while they were sitting at the table. But when? During the toast? After?" "After," Bernie said quietly. "During toast, all eyes are on each other. It's a social moment. After, attention scatters." He was right. After the toast, after the drink, the party would have resumed their conversation. Leonard would have gotten up to head to the bar. The singing and the atmosphere were all at play. In a moment of inattention, "Charlotte," I said, remembering. Vi said Charlotte was fussing over Peggy with a handkerchief, dabbing her face to remove smudged lipstick. Richard, by contrast, had sat stiff as a lamppost, fingers clenched around his glass, staring past his wife as if she were an unfortunate piece of furniture. Whatever else he was, he hadn't been the one leaning in to touch her. I glanced at the chair that had been Diana's. Diana had her back half turned toward the stage, remember? She was more interested in Dolly's song and catching Finn's eye for another round. I closed my eyes, reconstructing the memory. Charlotte, leaning close to Peggy, one hand on her shoulder, the other hand holding that white handkerchief, pressing it to Peggy's mouth. "Your lipstick is smudged," she'd said, or something like that. A perfectly reasonable thing for one woman to say to another at a party. "Except, the handkerchief," I breathed. "The poison wasn't in the drink at all. It was on the handkerchief. She dabbed Peggy's lips with it, and the arsenic transferred through the mucous membranes." "Would that work?" Dolly asked skeptically. Bernie nodded slowly. "Concentrated arsenic on cloth, pressed to lips, mouth slightly open? Yes, would work. Might even work faster than in drink, more direct absorption." I opened my eyes, looked at my team. Charlotte Winters killed Peggy Ashworth. But why? What motive could she possibly have? "Old friendship gone bad?" Finn suggested. Vi's voice came from the stairs. I turned to see her descending, slightly out of breath. "Sorry, I went to your apartment first. Bernie sent me down. But I've been doing more digging, Ellie. Charlotte Winters and Peggy Ashworth have known each other since they were girls, and 20 years ago they were engaged to the same man. I felt the pieces clicking into place. Peggy stole him." "More than that," Vi said, joining us at the table. "The man, Jonathan Miller, got Charlotte pregnant, then abandoned her when Peggy told him Charlotte wasn't suitable. Charlotte lost everything. Her reputation, her fiancé, and the baby died in childbirth. She was ruined. Had to live quietly, never married, spent the last 20 years as a kind of shadow in society." The tragedy of it settled over me like a weight. "And Peggy?" "Peggy married Richard 2 years later. Jonathan Miller moved to New York. Charlotte has spent 2 decades being Peggy's dear friend, watching her living the life that should have been hers." I thought about Charlotte's face at the party, that brittle composure, that mechanical laugh. I thought about how she'd looked at Peggy, and suddenly I understood. Not jealousy, not even hatred, really, just a kind of exhausted despair that had finally found its outlet. "I need to talk to her," I said. "Ellie, is that wise?" Dolly's concern was obvious. "If she killed once—" "She won't kill again," I said with more confidence than I felt. This wasn't about killing. This was about justice. Twisted, terrible justice, but justice nonetheless. I need to hear her say it. And then I looked at Bernie. "Could you telephone Detective Sullivan?" Tell him to meet me at Charlotte Winter's address in 1 hour? Bernie nodded and headed for the office. You're not going alone, Finn said flatly. No, I agreed. I'm not. Charlotte Winters lived in a modest apartment in a respectable building, the kind of place for women of reduced circumstances who still maintained the appearance of gentility. A kind neighbor held the door for us as she was leaving, and Finn and I climbed to the 3rd floor. Charlotte answered the door wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back severely. When she saw me, something passed across her face. Not fear, but resignation. Miss Hartwood, she said quietly, may we come in? She stepped aside, and we entered her small, neat apartment. It was furnished simply, but tastefully, a woman making the most of limited means. On the mantelpiece, I noticed a photograph of 2 young women, arms linked, smiling at the camera. One was clearly Charlotte, 20 years younger. The other was Peggy Ashworth. We were friends once, Charlotte said, following my gaze. Real friends. Before she stole Jonathan Miller, I said gently. Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. She sat down on the sofa, and I sat across from her. Finn remained standing by the door, watching. How did you know? She asked. The handkerchief, I said. Vi saw you dab Peggy's lips with it. The arsenic was on the cloth, not in her drink. Charlotte nodded slowly. I've had that handkerchief for months, soaking it in the solution, letting it dry, soaking it again. I wasn't even sure it would work, but I had to. I had to try. She gave a small, exhausted laugh. No one else knew. Why now? I asked. After 20 years, why now? Because I'm dying, Charlotte said simply. The doctor gave me 6 months, perhaps a year, and I realized I'll die having lived my entire adult life in Peggy's shadow. She destroyed me, and she never even acknowledged it, never apologized, never even seemed to remember what she'd done. Her voice was steady, but tears were streaming down her face. She called me her dear friend, her oldest friend. She invited me to her birthday party at that scandalous speakeasy, laughing about spending Richard's money, talking about all the lovely things she was going to do. And I couldn't anymore. I couldn't watch her be happy while I've been dying alone for 20 years. The room was silent except for Charlotte's quiet weeping. I felt a deep, terrible sadness, not just for Peggy Ashworth, though her death was tragic, but for Charlotte Winters, who'd been destroyed so long ago that the woman she'd become was barely recognizable as human. Charlotte, I said quietly, you know I have to tell the police. I know. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I'm almost relieved, actually. I'm so tired, Miss Hartwood. So very tired. A knock came at the door, and Finn opened it to reveal Detective Sullivan. He took in the scene with practiced eyes, Charlotte's tears, my position across from her, the weight of confession hanging in the air. Miss Winters, he said, I'm going to need you to come with me. Charlotte stood with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She picked up her handbag, took one last look around her small apartment, and walked to the door. But she paused before leaving, turning back to me. Miss Hartwood, thank you. For what? For understanding, for not looking at me like I'm a monster. She smiled sadly. Even though I suppose I am. You're a woman who was wronged, I said. That doesn't make what you did right, but it makes it human. Sullivan thanked Finn and me for coming forward, then guided Charlotte gently out into the hall. When the door closed behind them, the apartment seemed to exhale. I stood for a moment, listening to the fading echo of their footsteps on the stairs. You all right, Ellie? Finn asked. I'm not sure what I am, I admitted. Tired, relieved, hungry, oddly enough. I managed a small laugh. He offered me his arm. Come on then, let's get you home before you fall over. A week later, as I was pretending to tidy stems that didn't need tidying, the bell over the flower shop door jingled. Detective Sullivan stepped in, looking faintly out of place among the lilies. Captain Donnelly still hates that you exist. he said without preamble, resting his hat on the counter. "But he hates paperwork more. Charlotte Winters has confessed. The medical examiner's report matches her story. As far as the department's concerned, the Ashworth case is closed, and your part in it is finished." He gave me a look that was almost a smile. "Homicide has no more excuse to camp out in your basement. What you choose to pour down there is the Volstead squad's problem, not mine. And today, not the captain's either. For the moment, he's decided you're not worth the extra trouble." "I'll send him a bouquet," I said dryly. "He'd probably consider that an insult." Sullivan settled his hat back on his head. "Keep your nose as clean as you can, Miss Hartwood, and if trouble comes from his direction again—" He hesitated. "Well, you know where to find me." "At the station at 8 in the morning?" I asked. This time his smile reached his eyes. "If you're lucky, somewhere with better coffee." When he was gone, I stood alone among the flowers for a long moment, feeling something in my chest unclench. The worst was over, for this case at least. The Velvet Note had never been legal. It survived the way most speakeasies did in Chicago, tucked between blind eyes and the occasional bribe. But for now, Donnelly had lost his best excuse to come after me, and the Velvet Note belonged to me again. That evening, the Velvet Note reopened. Word had already begun to spread that I'd been cleared of real suspicion, that the police had taken someone else away in handcuffs. My regulars drifted back like birds returning to a familiar roost, shrugging off the shadow of the night before in favor of music and company and gin that didn't taste like bathtub cleaner. The team gathered at the bar, Finn pouring drinks with his usual efficiency, Dolly singing something soft and sweet, with just enough melancholy to match the day, Bernie sitting quietly in his usual corner, watching everything with those kind, knowing eyes. "To staying open," Finn said, raising his glass. "To Ellie's first case," Dolly added, raising hers. I raised mine, but didn't drink immediately. "First and last," I said. "I'm a businesswoman, not a detective." They all laughed, and I knew they were right to. Something had shifted in me. I'd looked at a murder and found the truth not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. Because someone had to. The city was full of secrets, and some of them were bound to find their way to my doorstep. And next time, because there would be a next time, whether I wanted it or not, I'd be ready. The Velvet Note might be my home, but the truth, I was learning, belonged to no one and everyone.